third speaker for today will be Ellen Keitel, professor of history at the University of Utah.
Idaho.
I'm sorry, it's written right here, Idaho, and I'm a Westerner, and I shouldn't be stumbling over these Western states.
We try to forget.
Among which I grew up. So yes, from the University of Idaho. She has published widely in areas related to the topics we've already been introduced to, articles with titles such as Guardianship Over Women in Medieval Flanders, Traveling for Atonement, Civilly Imposed Pilgrimages in Medieval Flanders, and today she will be speaking to us under the title, What's in a First Name? The Correlation of Personal Identity with Economic Autonomy in Medieval Flanders. Professor Keitel.
Thank you. My apologies for the sort of crude PowerPoint after these downright professional from my highly esteemed colleagues. Also, one of the things that struck me about this particular paper and Lorraine's paper is that, and I made notes in her book manuscript over and over, anonymity, this person disappears, this person doesn't have agency, which in fact evokes the work that I have done on this particular topic, which is what's in a first name. Clearly, I mean, this is an interesting observation. The connections that Lorraine's book manuscript has been able to raise in issues, a number of things. What is an account? What's the difference between a bailiff's account and a regular account? What can you read in them? But also, and again, I noted that, and when she last spoke, of the issue of anonymity in the sense that this person is now a murderer. This is not an article which has a first name. So I'm going to read this, and I'm going to try to read it in a clear and not so speedy fashion that our esteemed leader says, could you finish? That kind of thing. So comparison of late 14th century Mortmain payment in Kortrijk, a small commercial city, with those of Tielt, a more real community in the county of Flanders, reveals that the bailiff of Kortrijk routinely identified women using a personal name, while the bailiff of Tielt slotted them nameless into a more relational categories of wife, widow, and daughter. The habitual identification of women by their own first names in Kortrijk suggests that the impulse there to identify each woman individually, particularly when backed up with economic advantage, was still strong enough to blunt the countervailing impulse, as Chanel has talked about, as represented by practice in Tielt, towards identification within the household as embedded and subsumed under a male head. Just one caveat. I enjoy the distinction of being the only pre-Burgundian historian in this particular very distinguished gathering, and I think the world ends in 1384. Okay. In 1384, the bailiff of Kortrijk in the county of Flanders collected a cow, a pig, a bed, and an implement, in this case an anvil, from the estates of women named Tries, Kalle, Margriet, and Anais, respectively. That same year, not far away, the bailiff of Tielt collected similar items from the goods of women identified as the widow of Gerhards van der Velde, the wife of Gilles Firen, Sangar's wife, and Jan Mullert's daughter. These were essentially death taxes, items traditionally paid to a local lord upon the death of a serf. Although serfdom had all but disappeared from Flanders, the count, through his bailiffs, nonetheless made claims to these payments when the volatility of the 1380s, a period of high mortality due to war and disease, take your choice, they're rampant at this point, and the rebellion of the city of Ghent, something Ghent seemed to want to do every 20 years, enabled him to do so. Collecting some payments allowed him not only to boost his revenues, but also to make his power real in regions bordering the rebellion. Entries in Bolivial accounts reveal a great deal more than the extent of those revenues. The listing, quote, item from the death of Anais van Gavere, 1 cow, resold 44 shillings, for example, catalogs who died and what item was plucked from their goods, as well as what, for the bailiff, was the most important thing, how much money he could get for it. In the aggregate, however, lists of such entries also reveal what routines were used in identifying individuals. This, in turn, provides considerable insight into the social status of women in the two communities under investigation. What is immediately apparent from the comparison of these two sets of lists is that the bailiff of Kortrijk routinely identified women by personal name, while the bailiff slotted them into more impersonal relational categories of wife, widow, and daughter. Tris, Cala, Mergrit, and Anais, however, came from Kortrijk, the nearby regional and commercial center renowned for its linen production. To be sure, Tris was described as somebody's daughter, Anais was married, and Cala and Margrit, on the other hand, are not identified with reference to anyone. Moreover, all bear their own first names, regardless of affiliation. Comparison on the data of mortmain payments from Kortrijk, a small commercial city, with those of Tielt, again, as a more rural community, suggests that these differences in first name usage meant something. Within the context of an urban culture like that of found in Kortrijk, the identification of a woman by a first name reflects the relative economic and social autonomy, while in Tielt, the more organizational use of first names, typically augmented by such specification, reflects the embedding of the woman in a household. That's the introduction. The next section is the best item, Mortmain, Meyer Kief Beste Catalan. It's an interesting thing in 1380. These are two separate things. Mortmain is a thing that's associated with feudalism, and Meyer Kief Beste Kappel is associated with manorialism, but neither system was very prevalent in Flanders at all. Mortmain is usually associated with feudal relationships. Lords typically enjoyed the right of appropriating the, quote, best item from the estate of a decedent as a sign of his authority. Best Catalan means essentially translated in English, best chattel. Chattel being the word from which we get our word English chattel. Essentially, death tax. These payments were intensely local. The Count of Flanders acts through the person of his bailiff, thus giving the practice not only a supra-regional, but also a standardizing character. That's very important for when you're looking for trends. You want something that doesn't have a lot of details, but has a basic routine. The bailiff took the item, sold it, and listed the revenue in his account, which was subsequently audited by the Count's court. In late 14th century Flanders, the traditionally seigneurial practice of mortmain had thus become thoroughly integrated into the bureaucratic administrative apparatus of a regional prince. But late in his reign, Count Louis of Malle was at war with his largest city, Ghent, and his capacity to extract mortmain from nearby Kortrijk and Tielt served in part as a demonstration as to how deep his authority bit. The linguistic instability of labels testifies to the evolving nature of the power relationships among Count, city, and what Peter Stabel calls the kleine Stadt. The capacity of the Count actually to obtain mortmain payments serves as an index of the immediacy of his power within these particular communities, as regularly recurring events chronicled in an essentially managerial record. Mortmain payments thus reflects the Count's attempt in 1383 to 1385 to pass off as customary the intrusion of his own authority that such exactions represented. To be sure, a particular item in and of itself cannot necessarily be taken as emblematic of the worth of the whole estate. An estate, for example, might have included the cow the bailiff had appropriated as best item and little else. That, however, is unlikely. One had to have resources to maintain a cow or a pig, let alone a horse. The less fundamental an item, the more social prestige it brought with it. The owner of a horse was likely to have greater social status than the owner of a pig or a bed or even just a frock. It was not without reason that the documents call these items the best item, as opposed to the most expensive one. Data. The data for this study come primarily from the bailiff's accounts of Kortrijk and Tielt during the period from May 1383 to January 1385. Found in 3 physical rolls, the counts cover the last months of the reign of Count Louis of Malle, who died in 30 January 1st, 1384, and the earliest period of Burgundian control. These accounts thus yield a coherent and manageable corpus of data over a relatively short period of time. There are 216 entries for Kortrijk. Some of these include more than one person, bringing the total number to 233. The accounts for Tielt list 65 entries, of which 2 are joint in nature, thus bringing the total persons list to 67. Entries, whether from Kortrijk or Tielt, are equally concise in nature, and seriously concise. Quote, likewise, from the death of blank item, unquote. Accounts also note if a collected item has been redeemed, or resold, verkocht. The entry ends with a notation of the resultant monetary sum. I'd like to take a moment to explain that whether joint entries will be likewise from the death of X and their son, daughter, wife, whatever, then they will take 2 items, not 1, particularly in Kortrijk. So each item indicates that, basically speaking, that item is associated, if not perhaps belongs to the individual from whom it is taken. Items and price. I have divided the data into 8 categories. Identified the status of the individual, number 1, wife of, or the first and last name only. 2, whether she bears her own first name, e.g. Mabin van Schoolbeek, as opposed to Roger Josefswijk. Or 3, her own last name. Roger Josefswijk does not, while Mabin van Schoolbeek does. 4, type of item, yielded up, animal, furniture, etc. 5, specific item, cow. 6, whether this includes a modifier, small, miserable. And 7, whether it has been resold or redeemed. And 8, the most important information for the for the bailiff, and the least important information for me almost is the amount that is being collected. We come to the nub of the matter. This is identifications. Although accounts had evolved to the point that their lists delivered information in a condensed, standardized fashion, formulas of personal identification do not reach that point. We tend to think of an individual coming up and having a formula, Mr. this, Mrs. this, so-and-so. This was not the case in late 14th century Flanders. A combination of stress and grief on the part of the decedent's family, together with the bailiff's undoubted desire to make a quick and efficient accounting of the business at hand, doubtless had the effect of peeling back any extraneous identifying information and revealing, as much as it can be said to exist, a habitual identity expressed in an entry's initial formulaic slot, an essential identity. So what we probably should visualize is this person of authority who carries with him a certain authority and a certain fear and trembling, understandable. They ask, who are you? And this person will respond with their most habitual one that they think will please the bailiff. So that's one of the interesting things to think of the psychology of the moment when this information is yielded out. The bailiff, who is far too busy to try to fit or corset somebody's idea into a particular shape, his clerk or himself will jot this down and then it'll become there. So basically speaking, under this particular pressure, which makes this information very valuable, you yield up your essential way you think of yourself. Or you think that the bailiff thinks you should think of yourself, which is one of the significant things about it. Exactly. Under these circumstances, identification itself remained relatively non-formulaic, appearing to be rather reflexive in nature. The continued haphazardness of personal identification in the accounts suggests that the last word did not come from the scribe. Instead, public identity, particularly in Kortrijk, probably resulted from negotiations involving circumstance, habit, and on the part of the clerk, an impulse to formula. In the end, it would appear that public identification was driven less by prescription than by usage and instinct. 13th and 14th century routines for personal identification involved prefixes, titles, first and last names, as well as postpositional phrases, what we might call modifiers. And the example I give, and I'm sorry I don't have a PowerPoint for this, is Jonkvrouw Celian, first name, van den Knok, as an example, Beatrice van Piron Herman. So basically, it comes down to both two formulas. They attest to as many as 16 types of modifying phrases, particularly in larger urban centers such as Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres. 16 ways of thinking about somebody. These latter forms of identification can be divided into two categories: those that identify women simply as herself without reference to any familiar relationship, and those that use the modifying phrase specifically, such as relationship. Fortunately for this particular talk, in my amount of time, there's only a couple of identifications in both Kortrijk and Tielt, but I'd like to point out that in Ypres, as well as in Bruges and Ghent, you have things like, I'm a religious person, a beguine, for example, or you would have somebody say, I am a spinner, or somebody else saying, I'm an orderess, or something like that. So you do have occupational identifications as well. We get to the crux of the matter, first names. First name usage was clearly less customary in Tielt than it was in Kortrijk. There you go. As it bang into this anyway. So in Kortrijk, no first name is only 13%. In Tielt, it's 61%. 87% of women in Kortrijk are identified by their first name. And if you recall some of the comments that were made in the race paper, this is of great significance. This is a personalization, a shift, in fact, from what has happened. While none of the women marked as married bear a first name in Tielt, none, 3/4 of them do in Kortrijk. The data show that as a general rule, these women are better off than unnamed ones. And we're going to give this, as soon as I find this, we're going to give this a try to see if we can come up with another one. Percent of women, percent of revenue, Kortrijk, the two. And my apologies, having the smaller one is not a political or psychological issue here. I'm not trying to make a thing like that. No first name. In other words, you have 80%. Anyway, I don't know. All right, so we'll go for that. The aggregate average of value of items obtained from named married women is 44 shillings, is 4 more than the aggregate average from the nameless. In principle, identifying a woman here we go into linguistics. In principle, identifying a woman relationally would obviate the need to specify her first name as well. The accounts of Tielt overwhelmingly follow this economy principle. Only 2% of the women in Tielt who identify relationally also bear first names, and none of them are married. The Kortrijk accounts present a radically different picture. Full 75% of relationally identified women additionally bear their Christian names. The routine omission of a first name in Tielt for almost all women tagged as someone's child, wife, or widow emphasizes the folding of the members of the familial group into a single identity of the male whose name anchored the family, wife of male name, or male name, wife of something like that. The overwhelming use of first names in Kortrijk, combined with a large number of women who remained untagged with any familiar information, suggests an equally powerful impulse to retain a degree of personal identity, whether or not a relational epithet alone would have sufficed to specify the woman in question. This focus on women's individual identity in Kortrijk, even apart from any strictly logical need to specify a first name for identificatory purposes, is very likely explainable in practical economic terms. In Tielt, the omission of a first name makes it difficult to believe that the item yielded up to the bailiff belonged to her. Instead, it presumably belonged to the family within which the identifying category was nested. Conversely, the presence in Kortrijk of accounts of given names that identify women as individuals in their own right may well reflect an implicit understanding of those women as potential or actual property owners in their own right. Both in Tielt and Kortrijk, then, the use of first name might well be taken as indexing a degree of social and economic responsibility. But whereas in Tielt, the first name usage signaled economic disadvantage, in Kortrijk naming practices, particularly for the married and the widowed, was less an index of social relationships within the family than of social economic relationships within society at large. Married and widowed women identified by their first names are likely to have been contributing members to the familial economic unit, if not even its sole supporters. In Kortrijk, at least, the presence of a first name bridged the gap between those marked as married or as someone's child and those marked as unmarked by affiliation. The autonomous personhood attributed to named married women might not be equivalent to that associated with women who bore both their first and their own last names, those not relationally identified. But in the context of Kortrijk society, they enjoyed a greater sense of personal identity than did their unnamed counterparts. In contrast, the absence of a relational modifier in Kortrijk functioned more as an economic than a social marker, indicating in effect that this unaffiliated person is responsible for herself alone. Does membership in the category married with a first name correspondingly indicate that the person in question was a significant contributor to the family? If so, then the focus was presumably less on the person to whom her identity is anchored. We are talking about an oral society, one that in fact uses inflection, louder, softer differences, as a way of conveying, and writing doesn't do that. So we have the entry, Kathleen Habier's wife. We can read that, Kathleen. Roger Habier's wife. Or we can talk about Kathleen Habier's wife. The person there would understand that. We as long distance, in the temporal sense, cannot understand it. The description acting essentially as an additional disambiguating identifier that there are a lot of Kathleen's, and this one is the one associated with Roger Habier. On this hypothesis, such identification would signify that the public at large recognizes her chiefly, if not exclusively, in her own persona. This is not an issue that rises when one looks at the data in Tilt, nor in any other part of the world where first names are absent and identity rests in a family name where there is no distinction, unlike in Kortrijk, between family name and surname. A whole nother page will work on that one. It's hard to escape the conclusion that Kortrijk, at least, the economic value of the particular item yielded in Mortmain was correlated with the degree of respect or disrespect indexed by a first name. The higher the value of the item associated with women referred to by personal name, the higher the value of first name, the higher value in society herself. I'm going to take a look and see what else we have here. So we have that identify as child in first name, identify those as related to somebody else's first name. And that's the table on some of this. Conclusion. Oh, yay. Well over 4/5 of women, 87% in general, and 3/4 of women marked as married in Kortrijk bear first name. Did the evolution of the first name usage in Kortrijk indicate a diachronic falling apart of the patriarchal family or the persistence of an ethos of personal autonomy? Falling apart of the patriarchal family? Persistence of an ethos of personal autonomy. Correspondingly, did the lack of the first names in Tielt represent a new imposition of patriarchal norms or the continuation of a more conservative tradition? The answer may well depend on who provided the information. The dynamic that led to the use of personal names in Kortrijk may well have been risen from the population itself. That is to say, reference and their families may simply have chosen the descriptions that they found most convenient. I have a big theory that the dynamic of history is convenient. This would explain the greater variety of types of reference there. In Tielt, by contrast, the decision to use or not to use first names may have rested more with bailiffs. The lack of a first name might not have been an indication of time immemorial practice, and thus a patriarchal system, but rather a template imposed by an outsider, the bailiff, simply because he could do so, to a degree that his counterpart in Kortrijk could not. On this view, the bailiff of Tielt would have functioned as a more successful representative of the patriarchal hegemon embodied in the count, particularly in the Franco-Burgundian dukes. A simpler explanation might be the one discussed above. Identity came from below, not above, or at best from a combination of the two. The frequent omission of familial details in Kortrijk accounts might well have been an expression of the bailiff's indifference to anything other than their item collected and how much he could get for it. It might also have been, unlike in Tielt, an expression of local preference for horizontal personal identification, as manifested in the use of first and last names, over vertical lineage and dependence on as the organizing social principle. Convenience would dictate that the bailiff took the easiest path to the acquisition and listing of an item. If local practice privileged persons over patriarchy and patrilineality, it was not worth his time to do anything other than take down the person's name in the locally accepted fashion. If this was the case, it becomes possible that identity in Tielt was largely determined at this time by the impersonal nature of female identity, that had become customary, in other words, to depersonalize women's identity by omitting their first names in favor of their familial associations, except for those poor females who either were on their own, essentially, and who described themselves as such, and were by definition poor. The evidence from Tielt suggests a step in the evolution towards folding women anonymously into the marital couple, and highlights not only the economic benefits of such an association, but also by extension, the increasing identification of the family unit as embodied in and subsumed under the male spouse. The evidence from Kortrijk, particularly the habitual identification of women by their own first names, suggests that the impulse there to identify each person individually, particularly when backed up with an economic advantage, was still strong enough to blunt a countervailing impulse towards administrative convenience, represented by the shorter and more formulated usage on Tielt. Thank you.